Quick quiz for you. Name the top 3 cities on planet Earth which are projected to have the highest populations in the year 2100. So just for reference today, those top 3 most populous cities are Tokyo, Japan, Delhi, India, and Shanghai, China, with populations of 37, 34, and 30 million people respectively. Okay, I'll give you a second. So the year's 2100, what are the top 3 most populous cities on Earth? Okay, here's the answer. Lagos, Nigeria, Kinshasa, Congo, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, with populations estimated to be 88 million, 83 million, and 73 million respectively. Just insane numbers. These come from models from the Global Cities Institute report, by the way, which is a widely cited and reputable institution. I'll put a link to the full list in the description, but 5 of the top 7 cities on that projection are in Africa, with Khartoum, Sudan, and Niamey, Niger slotting in at 6 and 7, just behind Delhi and Mumbai. Okay, so I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to bring it up in my forthcoming conversation, which is a conversation that I'll jump into with Vijay Prashad. He's a journalist and author who's been writing powerfully about what he calls the Global South, or the Third World Project, which involves in-depth research and analysis of various liberation and anti-colonial movements. I'll just let him speak for himself. And then just as a quick note to new listeners and my viewers, my previous 2 essays are useful to track a bit of my personal approach to these topics. And if you haven't watched them, you may want to. I tell the story of my refusal to go to Israel in the summer after my junior year of high school, and then the somewhat random sequence of events that led me instead to Ghana in West Africa, and how that experience implanted so many questions and connections, which are now really just overflowing in my mind and my philosophical work. And so you'll understand the ways in which I'm attempting to place the just absolutely atrocious and horrific and genocidal campaign that we're seeing in Gaza and extending now to a much larger historical trend that I think we're all going through. And then throughout the interview, I sprinkle in a few photos and other visual references that you'll see to many of the things that Vijay and I mentioned along the way. But I'm also going to come back after the interview to just share some more notes and more in depth, and also some of my reflections on the conversation and references for those who are interested in following a few of the threads that we touch on throughout and going deeper, which I hope is several of you, because I know it's tempting to just click around on YouTube or the news and digest more and more of the horror and outrage and maybe arguments that you already know. But I urge you, and of course I'm really just reminding myself of doing this here, to do more of what we should be doing, which I think is also shifting our attention sometimes to historical instances and biographies and deeper dives into arguments, which are really incredibly relevant upon close inspection. So without further introduction, I give you the amazing Vijay Prashad. Let me just start actually by telling you that I have become a little obsessed in the last 5-6 months or so with post-World War II Africa, liberation movements, 1945 onward till the 70s. That window seems insanely important. And it's something that is almost completely absent from an American education. I'm 42 years old, so, going to school in the 90s, 2000, none. I got none of that. And I've become obsessed with it, picking up every book I can and voraciously reading it. And it seems that's a hole in history that should be filled by people who want to understand what's going on. So I'm going to get there. But first, I want to ask you about your journey to this before we dive into this. How did you get interested in these questions on a personal level? Where did you grow up? Where was your first encounter with these bigger questions about the global South and all that stuff?
I mean, look, I grew up in Calcutta in India, and, was very fortunate to have parents with an ecumenical understanding and understanding the importance of the world that I was living in. I was born in 1967. It's a pretty epochal year. And so I was sort of coming to a kind of rudimentary understanding of the world pretty early in the late 70s. I have to say that my father was, in my early part of my life, he was involved in business, in politics. He also worked for the Indian Mining Association and was involved in selling coal to various countries, including travel to Japan right after World War II to sell coal to the Japanese. In 1974, my father took me with him to Libya. I was a young boy, and I suppose he wanted to take me for whatever reason. And we flew into, after, there was no aircraft, it was propeller. We flew Calcutta, Mumbai, I think it was Manama, Bahrain, Manama to Cairo. And then we took an overnight train to Alexandria and drove to really the whole of the northern part of the Mediterranean from Alexandria to Tripoli. And it was an incredible experience for a couple of reasons. One is, well, it's beautiful. You've got the hinterland of the desert on your left all the way because we're driving westward, and on your right, the Mediterranean. And there were some things that were notable. One was the wreckage of World War II was right there. We drove through El Alamein, we drove through Benghazi, Tobruk. There were actually German half tracks sitting in the desert. You may not know this, but even until the early 70s, the second most important export from Libya was scrap metal from World War II. The most important export was a kind of grass out of which paper was made. Oil hadn't yet begun flowing in the volumes later. The other impressive thing was driving into Libya in 1974. That's 5 years into Gaddafi's time in office. And, there was an enormous picture of the various colonels and captains that had overthrown the monarchy. And they were incredibly popular. I mean, that's something it's very hard to explain to people, that Gaddafi was this really beautiful young man. And when they conducted the coup d'etat, King Idris fled the country and not a shot was fired because the monarchy was so unpopular. And so all of these sorts of experiences, thanks to my parents and my mother's capacious interest in the whole world, despite the fact that she barely finished high school, was very, very, involved in trying to understand, what was happening here, there, everywhere around the world. They were prodigious newspaper readers. But also, you have to understand that this is India in the 70s and early 80s, when the whole Third World Project was everywhere. I remember going as a little boy. I mean, I actually have a memory of this when the street upon which the US consulate and the British consulate sits used to be called, I've forgotten the name of the road, but the name was changed to Ho Chi Minh Road during the tail of the Vietnam War. This is the context in which I was raised.
Yeah.
These great figures like Tito and Nasser, these were the touchstones. So it was impossible not to imbibe a sense of the Third World Project, which I wrote about later, but it was already there. I mean, my first major piece of writing for my school was on the oil shock of 1973.
Yeah.
And that was because of it as an oil weapon.
Yeah, amazing. Well, then let me jump into that question then, because I did not have this childhood. Very, very, very different, suburban. I tell the story in the last essays, coddled kid from Allentown, Pennsylvania, and I was dying to see that world for some reason. Right, I had this sense that my parents were sending me off, or wanted to send me off to Israel, like all the other friends in my neighborhood, and it's kind of this pilgrimage that you just are expected to do. And I was rebelling against it for all kinds of reasons I could scarcely understand. And I tell the story in the last piece, so I won't repeat it, but I end up randomly going to Ghana. And again, I encourage people who are interested in this conversation before or after to check out that essay to understand a bit of my questioning here. But I learned the name Kwame Nkrumah for the very first time. Why is his name important, or maybe indicative, if people are looking for an entry into everything you just said, all these names that we may have vaguely heard, but kind of get, memory hold, as it were, in the West? Why is Kwame, I think he's a good candidate to revive and to look at as maybe a case study that is a good place to start. I don't know, make the case for Kwame and tell people what happened to him, because I don't tell that full story in the previous essay.
Yeah. I mean, look, firstly, he's an interesting figure because he comes as a bridge between two different generations. In a sense, Kwame Nkrumah, who's born in the Gold Coast, a British colony. It's called the Gold Coast for a reason. That's where the British essentially siphoned off gold to finance the Industrial Revolution. Also, that's where a lot of people who had been enslaved in the African continent eventually crossed to the Americas. In Accra, there's an emblematic place where the people who had been enslaved were held as they made the so-called Middle Passage to get to the Americas. It was a place of enormous suctioning of wealth into the Western Hemisphere and into Europe. Nkrumah is born into that world, very bright man, enters into whatever education he can find, by hook or by crook. He gets himself, various scholarships to go to other towns to study, and this is really to his credit. He's an ambitious person, but then he goes to the United States. On the way to the United States to study at Lincoln University, which, I mean, I understand you in Allentown breathing some of the air of Nkrumah, and perhaps you fell down one day and skinned your knee, and a little of Nkrumah's energy that he had deposited in Pennsylvania entered you. I mean, it's not a coincidence that these things happen, that you are from Pennsylvania and he goes to Pennsylvania. But in fact, the radicalization of Kwame Nkrumah doesn't happen in Pennsylvania. It happens in the Gold Coast. He's already very radical. When he arrives in London on his way to the United States, that's the day he sees a newspaper headline which says that Italy has invaded Ethiopia. And in 1935, when he sees that headline as a young man, he is outraged and he understands the racism of what's happening, the colonialism of what's happening, and how this is really a feature of a kind of out of control capitalism that wants to absorb the whole world for its own reasons. So Nkrumah, outraged that day, finds himself paralyzed and understands, because he writes about this in his autobiography, he understands that this requires the question not only of the independence of Africa from European control, because after all, he's upset by Italy invading Ethiopia. The Gold Coast was already in British hands. So it's not like, this was a big a departure. In fact, Ethiopia was in a better situation than the Gold Coast. But nonetheless, he understands, one, the independence question is important. Number two, he understands that Africa as a continent had been balkanized, had been divided up in a kind of senseless colonial history that wasn't Africa's history. For instance, Senegal, which was a French colony, part of French West Africa at the time, has a thin sliver of a British colony, Gambia, and that's because the British control the Gambia River. So Senegal, even today, is divided by this thin sliver. Now, interestingly, you say, well, it's French-speaking, British-speaking. It's nonsense. Less than 1% of the population of Senegal has French as their first language. That whole region, one of the primary languages is Wolof. That's what the people speak, whether they're in Gambia or in Senegal. Why these areas had to be divided for colonial reasons has a logic in commerce and capitalism, but not in the cultures of the people. Nkrumah gets that really early, goes to the United States, gets involved, therefore, in the Pan-African movement. You see, because if you understand that why is Africa divided in this way, it's a colonial geography, it's not an African geography. Instinctively, the politics that emerges is Pan-Africanism. All African people, not just on the continent, but in the diaspora, have to have a certain understanding of their general unity. That's Nkrumah's understanding. He comes back to England. He's involved in the 1945 Conference on Pan-Africanism in Manchester. He participates in helping organize that conference, along with people who influence him a great deal later. George Padmore, a very important figure from the Caribbean, a Marxist, a member of the Communist Party, hugely influential for Kwame Nkrumah. Later in life, Padmore comes and lives in Nkrumah's Ghana. Then Nkrumah goes back to Ghana after the 1945 Pan-African Conference, sets up a political entity, and through immense personal labor, in a little car, drives around all of the Gold Coast, going from town to village, giving speeches, The British tried to proscribe him. They jail him, but already he has forced them to have an election. World War II has ended. Britain is in a certain decline. They want to pacify the freedom movements in the colonies. They have to give up India and so on. Well, in the Gold Coast, they decide, let's have an election. Nkrumah, sitting in prison in Accra, is elected despite being in prison, not allowed to campaign. This is the beginning of the independence of Ghana. Having won independence, first in 1951 in a very constrained form, and then in 57, 58, 59, the transfer takes place. Nkrumah comes to power and he decides what's on the agenda: industrialization, literacy for the people, electricity. Electricity, elementary thing. The British colonized Africa, Asia. When the British left India, most people don't know the literacy rate in India was about 12%. I mean, hundreds of years of saying we are here to civilize you. And in fact, you had the opposite impact. People lost their own ability to be literate. Well, in Ghana, Nkrumah is pushing hard for this, but he also is pushing for a Pan-African dream. He's one of the really architects of the Organization of African Unity, created in 1963, which is now the African Union. That was the brainchild of Nkrumah. In Ghana, in Accra, he invites radicals from across Africa. Patrice Lumumba comes there, various other figures, also Frantz Fanon, representing Algeria, at a very important meeting in Accra. Nkrumah is the host. He's the mentor to Patrice Lumumba. In 1961, Patrice Lumumba is assassinated because he attempts in a young Congo, only free in 1960 from Belgian rule. Lumumba attempts to have sovereignty over the immense riches of the Congo, including a uranium mine from which uranium was taken for the two bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The uranium came from the Congo. The United States didn't want those mines out of US control. They participated in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1961. Nkrumah was really very annoyed about that. He sits down and he writes a classic book called Neocolonialism. I mean, while he is the president and then prime minister of Ghana, he writes this monumental book of how Africa has been treated. He then goes on a trip to Vietnam and to China, the People's Republic of China. And while he's there, United States, Britain, various other powers engineer a coup d'etat. The military takes power. They basically destroy. I mean, they're so vindictive. They burn his manuscripts, the work that he was doing. He ends up in exile with Sekou Touré across the border, tries his best to somehow influence currents in Ghana. His children are in exile in Egypt. He tries to build an African continental agenda, writes books about guerrilla struggle, about the importance of Africa uniting, but eventually dies in Eastern Europe in a hospital. A very sad end. But I must say, and I know I've taken a long time to tell this story, but I must say that Kwame Nkrumah is one of the most independent and free Africans in its history. And I very much hope people will look carefully again at the not only what he was saying then, but his enduring influence on Africa today.
Amazing. I know it was a lot. And thank you for knowing it all so well. I want people to look some things up too. Like just earmark these, the Patrice Lumumba speech, which was that he gave as the Belgian ambassador, whoever he was there, was sort of ceding power. Is remarkable. He was the king there. So.
King was there, and Patrice Lumumba turns to him and says, "We are no longer your monkeys."
Yeah, and there was worse than that too. It was a lot of like, "We won't forget our brothers who were beaten." I mean, it goes through the, and I'm going to tie this very very soon to where I want to go. I have two threads to pull on here. One is one thing you didn't mention about Nkrumah and maybe some other Pan-Africans at this time was their economic systems that they were sort of interested in, which may have been Marxist or more nationalist. And so you tell me how much of a ideological cover that story is for the West to go in some sort of, Cold War logic or something to crush this, or not, how seriously you take those kinds of claims. And then too, the other aspect that I want to bring this to is, you and I just talked about Africa for a while, and I've tapped you because, like many people, the last year since October 7th and what's happening as Palestine has, I think, has sent many people down a lot of these paths of asking bigger questions. And I want to try to bring some of this logic to that level as well as we proceed. And I know it seems disparate, but what's interesting, I don't know if you've seen Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book that he's touring around when he went to Senegal and Palestine, and is also tying these things together. I think a lot of people are starting to understand these bigger structures that you're talking about. That's just a little preview for the next question. But first, yeah, tell me also about, in Tanzania, I think there was also a Marxist kind of idea that they wanted their own kind of version of African collective farming, and all these kinds of ideas. How big of this was a threat to the American neoliberal capitalist world, and how much of that is just sort of a bullshit cover story of we just want control over the stuff?
I mean, it was a threat, and that's why they had to assassinate and kill people all the way up to the assassination of Thomas Sankara in 1987 in Burkina Faso. I mean, and that's the reason why the governments today of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali are all governed by, these progressive military people who want sovereignty for their country. I mean, you've asked a really very important question, and let me take the question at its at face value. Because what I understand Marxism to be an analysis of actuality. It's not like a bunch of ideas that sit out here in a book and you have to impose them on the world. What do I mean by that? Let's say you are a country like the Gold Coast, a territory, which is now become a country. You call it Ghana. Or you break up Tanganyika, which used to be briefly a German colony, and you have Tanzania, the new country. And you want to establish the sovereignty of the new country. That seems to be a basic first step. You don't have to be a Marxist to want to establish sovereignty over your people, over your resources, and so on. In that case, the next step is you're going to have to tell people who had constrained your sovereignty that they no longer can constrain your sovereignty. And now, who are we talking about? We're talking about multinational corporations. For instance, the gold companies that had just mined wealth and taken it out. No longer, my friends. If you're talking about, let's say, Cuba, it would be the sugarcane. You can't just own all the land, or if it's Guatemala in 1954, you can't just United Fruit control all the land and just harvest the bananas and increase the potassium intake of people in the United States, cut a banana into your yogurt, whatever, Chiquita Banana Company and so on. You can't do that. We need to control our resources. That means we need to have a better royalty system for what we earn from there. Our people must not be treated as animals as they work and so on. So the moment you do that, you have to confront the untrammeled power of the multinational corporations. And multinational corporations don't like their profit line to deteriorate. They take that very seriously. So then they turn to their powerful states. United Fruit Company, in fact, was partly owned by the Dulles brothers. The Dulles brothers, one of them being the head of the CIA, and the other at the time in the 50s being the head of the State Department, the Secretary of State. Well, the Dulles brothers took Jacob Arben's attempt to secure Guatemalan control over the land seriously, and they then utilized the full arsenal of the US government to coup Jacob Arbenz, who was a liberal, by the way. His wife was a Marxist. He was a liberal. But they coup Jacob Arbenz. They strip him naked in the airport on the flight to Mexico. And eventually in Mexico, he is traumatized. And eventually he dies, most likely commits suicide in the bath. Or his wife believes he was assassinated. I don't think they needed to assassinate him. I think he was broken. So the general logic of independence, you have independence politically, you demand sovereignty. To have sovereignty, you need to have control over your raw materials, your people.
Can I also just add currency as well? It's something that I think is overlooked. You also want to maybe trade in your own currency, which is obviously a huge threat. Just put
Absolutely.
that feather in the cap. Yeah.
Especially in so-called in the francophone world, very big issues still till today. So you want to do all that, and when you do that, you confront the multinationals. In other words, you confront global capitalism. Now, whether you are a Marxist or not, you are going to end up at this clash. Unless you say, I don't want sovereignty. If you want sovereignty, you're going to come up in this clash. In that sense, any national liberation leader who took the path of sovereignty was going to resemble a Marxist. Because, in a sense, what I'm saying is the theory of national liberation inevitably has a unity with Marxism. And so, whether Nkrumah was a Marxist, he, of course, had read Marx. His book on neocolonialism was filled with Marxist concepts and so on. Whether Julius Nyerere of Tanzania was a Marxist, which he was not. Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya was not a Marxist. These people were sincere national liberation leaders, but they, in their journey, basically went in the direction that Marxism would lead you. What Fidel Castro does in Cuba in 1959 is identical to what Kwame Nkrumah does in Ghana in 1959. They're on the same journey. There are, of course, other leaders that are not on this journey. Haiti, for instance, had a counter-revolution in 1957 led by Papa Doc Duvalier. And he basically said, we'll be a colony forever, as long as the Duvalier family makes a big killing. So you could actually say, we are not interested in sovereignty. Just my pockets should be lined. After Lumumba was killed in 1961, Joseph Mobutu, who takes power in his place, or later calls himself Mobutu Seko Seke, does something really interesting. Mobutu claims that to be independence is to be culturally independent. He changes the country's name to Zaire. But he's okay with the sovereignty of the land and the people to be compromised. So it's a kind of fake sovereignty. He changes his name. He Africanizes his name. He Africanizes the name of the country, but he doesn't Africanize the economy. He doesn't Africanize dignity. People are still treated as they were under colonial times. So my answer to your question is, it doesn't matter whether they're Marxists or not. They were a threat to the United States, to Europe, and so on, because the journey of sovereignty does clash with the necessity of these companies to exploit the rest of the world for their benefit. They don't want to share the wealth. They want to hoard it.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? This might have to do with also, because I want to ask about your distinction, because I'm not sure if I understand it yet, about neocolonialism and what you call hypercolonialism. But I'm also curious, with everything you just laid out, and I've admitted to you my obsession of reading a lot in this period, is can you walk through, I love that clash is unavoidable, and what these kinds of young national projects might have to do to keep sort of the very young, sloppy projects going. Because I think you will have, I think you know what I'm asking. It's like Nkrumah and plenty of the others get accused of sort of becoming authoritarian-ish, of like locking down the borders and, moving people off their land to demand that they work on certain farms and get this project off the ground. And you're always going to have dissidents and people who, don't really buy into like, this might be painful for a short amount of time, but the future is bright. The communist line of the bright, beautiful future of communism, and it just never comes. You're always going to have people who say like, I'm tired of this. Let's give up this silly fight. Things were better 5 days ago, even when the British were here. And those, of course, are the people who the CIA always finds and targets to lead the coup, right? I hope people don't get the impression that it was just a bunch of Americans flying in and like killing Nkrumah or any of these people. It's paying people, it's influencing people, it's journalists, but you're getting the local dissidents or maybe power-hungry people or families who just want the wealth. You're getting those people to play your game, which is so cynical, because then, of course, you can blame those countries for just being a mess, and they're not ready for democracy yet. Look at this, coup after coup. But can you talk about that period and how crucial it is? And, I showed the photograph, and I think you've talked about this before too in my previous essay, of Nkrumah when he learns of the coup and his head is in his hands when he's in China. And, there's so much in that photo, like I said, that just kind of tells the defeat. There's a sadness there of like he lost the war. And he ended up giving a lot of really great, interesting speeches from exile about these people who were taken in by the short-term bribes and lures of neocolonialism. Anyway, if you could respond to that, because I'm interested in how you get through that period when that I don't know if there's a successful country that has gotten through that period unscathed without sacrificing its own dignity and becoming a neocolonial lackey, which they can then point to. Maybe you could look at Ghana today of like the graphs are going in the right direction and you could talk about some kind of progress. But I think if Nkrumah could see it, he would be maybe not so thrilled with the deal with the devil, as it were. If you can, I think you know what I'm asking there.
This is a very important question. Let's go back to some of the conditions upon which you have to build a new state after colonialism, because that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're not talking about a hypothetical state. We're talking about places that had been under long periods of colonialism, hundreds of years, which had to recover from that rapidly. So what's the conditions? One, low literacy rates. What does that mean? That means you don't have two kinds of people that you need for the modern world. One is you need scientists and technicians and teachers immediately to help produce literacy among the general population. You can't build a new society without 100% or near 100% literacy. Secondly, you need 100% literacy, or at least more than 10%, if you're going to have a well-staffed public administration. When a post-colonial state emerges, the public administration is key. Because the private sector never existed in the colonies. Okay, it was a joke. What there was rather was big holding companies of the colonial masters that once the state was independent, they withdrew their tentacles and went back home in order to control it from afar. So that if you were a gold company, you were domiciled in Canada or in the UK, you had a Ghanaian representative, but all the Europeans, the Canadians, and the British who were working in Ghana in the 1950s, they started going back to their homelands and they tried to hire small companies and so on. The private sector was actually quite small in the immediate aftermath of the end of colonialism. So you had to build a state apparatus to manage things, to run things, to deal with resources and so on. For that, literacy is important. So you need a literacy curve that doesn't look like the easy slope of a mountain for a man of my age to walk up. It needs to be rock climbing. I mean, you need to be able to accelerate literacy. That means you got to divert a lot of resources to that and so on. There's no time in the early years to think about, building the spirit of democracy through elections. There just is no time. Many of these countries, in fact, officially, Algeria, Tanzania officially became one-party states. Julius Nyerere, who was a liberal person, he was a liberal in his outlook, very much influenced by European liberalism, nonetheless banned other political parties. He said, we need a holiday. We need a period where we can't be holding elections like you do in the West, where you're wealthy. We have to build the means of the productive forces in our country. We have to establish, literacy. You can't hold an election in a country with low literacy. That was his opinion. Okay, I don't necessarily agree with it, but that same in Algeria. In Algeria, the FLN decided it's a one-party state. In fact, Nkrumah didn't formally make it a one-party state. He allowed oppositions. But there's got to be a limit, In Fidel Castro's Cuba, where effectively they slowly moved to a one-party state, where they said, look, you can't have elections because, the imperialists don't come in through the front door. They walk under the door like ants, and they termites, and they'll eat in the infrastructure. So at one point, Fidel Castro was invited all of Cuba's important intellectuals to a theater in Havana, and he gave them a very interesting speech. it's widely available. It's called Fidel Speaks to the Intellectuals, where he argued the case. He said, look, we've made a revolution. He said, you can take positions because in a way it's easy for you. You can criticize this and that. We have to build things here. We are struggling to build things. We are building things with basically sticky tape and with bits of string. We don't even have a big industrial operation. We don't produce steel. How are we going to build, electric power lines? We don't have copper wires. We're struggling, in a context of a blockade. But he said, you are welcome to criticize us at any point. And indeed, I would say the Cubans have held to this. But he said, here's the formula for criticism. If you criticize us within the boundaries of the revolution, we are happy. Help us. Help us improve things. Say this doesn't work. Why don't you do it like this? But he says, if you criticize us outside the bounds of the revolution, where you say this revolution is the problem, we're going to overthrow it, bring the Americans back, then we can't tolerate you. And I think that's a pretty fair and judicious approach that many of these people took. You've got to understand that during colonial times in the Gold Coast, the cities along the coastline produced a certain elite. Some of this elite that was produced along the coastline was from the various chiefs, the three-stool chiefs of the Gold Coast, who then had their children go to these British boarding schools that were built along, again, the coastline. And they created a kind of combination of feudal colonial elite. This feudal colonial elite owned land. They had the privileges of being knighted by the British monarch and so on. This is the section that just didn't like what Nkrumah was doing. Not because Nkrumah was a Marxist or was in China or anything like that, but because Nkrumah was trying to empower their serfs. Nkrumah was trying to empower the mass of the people, who they didn't want to necessarily see empowered. You see this replicated all over the place. Colonialism created a kind of alliance with this feudal colonial class. Even in India, there was a class that basically, was like a limpet stuck to the rock of colonialism, the granite rock of colonialism. And that limpet was going to turn against any attempt to build sovereignty. For cultural reasons, they didn't want equality with people that they saw as lower than them, whether it's on caste lines or tribal lines or whatever. And then, of course, on economic grounds that, they owned land, they had houses, they were beneficiaries of colonialism. And so this class, which produces often the generals in the military, has a direct approach to the coup d'etat. In a book I wrote years ago, I said there's two kinds of coups. There's the general's coup, and the general often comes from the landed elites in their societies. And those are often conservative counter-revolutionary coups. And then there's the colonel or captain's coup. The captain comes from a much lower social class and is often closer to the people who are struggling. So, for instance, it's Colonel Gamal Abdul Nasser that conducts what I think of as a revolutionary coup against the monarchy of King Farouk of Egypt. On the other side, you have General Ayub Khan's coup in Pakistan, which is a coup for the landed elite against the democratization of that country. So yeah, I mean, there is a section that really kind of gives themselves over to reaction, to the other side of what people like Nkrumah are doing. They want to democratize society. And it's always been a great piece of frustration for me that people consider people like Nkrumah or Nyerere undemocratic, when in fact they were fighting against undemocratic forces whose kind of commitment to anti-democracy was in fact programmatic, whereas what Nkrumah or the Algerians or Nyerere did was simply pragmatically saying that we can't afford to have multi-party democracy now. Theirs was a more pragmatic understanding. But their enemies were programmatically against democratization. And the West lines up with them, not because the West is programmatically against democracy necessarily, but because these people wanted to help defend the West's interests in the colonies, particularly of the multinational companies.
There's a lot there, but I want to pick up the thread of that thing that you're on now about democracy. And I want to try to start shifting the conversation towards what I think you've been talking a lot about recently on other shows and in the world about this new changing attitude in the global South and maybe post October 7th. And I think because of, it may be why I focused so much on that period that we've now spent a lot of time on and is because it's so easily and massively just like, puts a piece of dynamite under this myth that probably I grew up on of like America cares about democracy and like that's what the fights in the world are about. The stuff that Joe Biden says about like the march of democracy and powers of light and evil and this kind of splitting the world about open and closed. And it does seem, for some people, I think, the United States alliances in the world, we don't even have to talk about Saudi Arabia, but Israel in particular, and this rhetoric about the only democracy in the Middle East and everything, I think that, I'm guessing, that is crumbling for more and more people. Even the people who, I don't know how you feel about it, but even the people who are defenders of Israel or have changed their tone. I grew up on a different kind of defense of Israel, which was much more ahistorical and just filled with a bunch of myths, a land without people for people without land, and they're a democracy. You hear less of that. Now it's much more of an aggressive, like they got to do what they got to do, they're in a bad neighborhood kind of stuff. I don't feel like people are walking around talking about Israel being this democracy so much. The scary thing is maybe people just don't care, but maybe we're getting a little bit more real now. To kind of flip that on its head, I see that as progress, and maybe you're nodding as well, of being like, that sent me down this path of like, wait, what the hell actually happened in Ghana, that country that I randomly went to instead of Israel and had all these questions about? What happened in all these other places? And when you just look at any of them, it's laughable that America cares about democracy or that's their intervention. It just falls apart completely. And so that's where it's taken me. But I'm curious if you think, tying that to what you are talking about the new attitude in the global South, if you could start tying this thread we're talking about to maybe these protests all around the world for Palestine are much more than the West Bank and Gaza and a particular issue. I feel like if there is a phrase like globalize the intifada that catches on, it's about much more than some settlements, as awful and as problematic as they are, on hills in the West Bank. It's about a global reckoning with everything we've just talked about.
Yeah, I want to come there. But before I come there, I want to just quickly summarize one of my favorite episodes from Curb Your Enthusiasm, which has to be, it has to be one of the funniest shows that's come out of the United States in a very long time.
My wife will like whatever you're going to say, but go on. Yeah.
No, partly because I think Larry David, to be honest with you, I thought Seinfeld was a boring show. And I was really glad that Larry David could cut his whatever ropes were holding him back. And I mean, Jerry Seinfeld is by himself just a dull person. So, but Larry David is a shining light because there's an episode about the Palestinian fried chicken restaurant, which if people haven't watched it, I just want you to go watch it. It's such a funny episode because Larry David is able to come into the heart of some of the extraordinary conflicts and dilemmas within the American Jewish community, because it effectively starts at a dinner table where everybody at the dinner table is Jewish in America one way or the other, some more observant and religious, others like Larry couldn't care less. And there's a discussion breaks out about how a Palestinian fried chicken restaurant that's quite good, and Larry has eaten there and likes it, is now moving and having a new branch on the same block as Katz's Deli. And so what happens is that some of the people at the table are outraged. Like, how can a Palestinian fried chicken restaurant be on the same strip mall as Katz's Deli? That's sacrilege. And they're going to go and protest. And Larry is uncomfortable because he likes the fried chicken. And so the whole episode, and I don't want to get more into it, just brings out where the debate in a way lies now. It doesn't lie on ideas of Masada and on the Holocaust and, those stories, which I think of as a sort of, in a way, pre-67 or at least pre-94 stories, depending on how you understand the gravity of those stories. The stories had a lot of weight pre-67, although opinion polls in the United States show much less support for Israel among the Jewish population in the United States before 67 than after the 67 war. And there are very interesting books written about that by quite mainstream people. I don't need to get into that. Point I want to make is that you're right. The defense now of Israel made by those who make it is not about that past and so on. It's just that this is our land. I mean, there are videos that circulate now of Israeli soldiers saying things like, we're going to take Lebanon, we're going to take Iraq, we're going to take Syria. I mean, this is all the promised land. It's a different level. This is not Masada anymore. This is a kind of different, weird, insane geography. I mean, it's insane. It's hard to really, really come together with this. But let's set all that aside, because I know what you're asking me. It's a very important question, and I'd like to actually take it beyond what's happening in Gaza, the massacres of people, and include Ukraine to this, because I think both of these things happening within a year and a half of each other, or year and 8 months of each other, has really shifted a kind of world perceptions. So first, the Ukraine crisis takes place. The Russian troops enter Ukraine. Now that's was basically not inevitable, but the clash was inevitable, because this clash has been going on for decades, if not, at least for the past decade. After 2014, it really accelerated. The clash was inevitable. I didn't anticipate Russian troops actually entering Ukraine, but it was not an enormous surprise. Okay, now there was a Munich Security Conference held right after the Russian troops entered. And at this conference, there was an interesting panel discussion. A white former German politician was sitting as the moderator of the panel, and he had three black women. Francia Marquez of Colombia, vice president of Colombia, was one important figure at the panel. But the most important figure was the prime minister of Namibia, a woman in her mid-50s. And now Namibia had not condemned Russia for entering into Ukraine. So this white man starts to attack the Namibian prime minister, saying, why don't you condemn Russia? And she says to him, we don't have to. And she makes 2 points. She says, one, it's not our war. It's a European conflict. We have our own problems in Africa. I thought that was incredible. That's Nkrumahism speaking. Second, she said that when we were fighting for independence, it was the Soviet Union that supplied us and helped us, and you didn't. Germany, in fact, backed our opposition, which was the South African apartheid state. So did the United States. So she said, why should I come to your so-called aid at a moment when you feel like you need us to rally behind you? You never rallied behind us when we were being butchered. Well, he was taken aback. Then subsequently, South Africa takes Israel to the International Court of Justice after several months of Israel's bombing of the Palestinians in Gaza. And when South Africa does that, Germany, again, says that, no, it's not genocide. They, of course, being world experts in genocide, say it's not genocide. The Namibian president, Sarah is the prime minister, the president then on Twitter says to the German government of Olaf Scholz, says, listen, you may claim that you know about genocide, but you've forgotten the genocide you conducted against us, against the Nama and Herero people between 1904 and 1908. What the hell? Now, when these kinds, and I have hundreds of these sorts of illustrations, yeah? I don't want to keep going on them. But when these things happen, when a country like Namibia, small country, can talk back so freely to the Germans, to the United States, whatever, what's going on? We decided in our institute, the phrase we were going to use to start trying to understand this is that there's a new mood in the global South. Why is there a new mood? What has changed? Couple of things. One thing that has definitely changed is a country like Namibia is no longer basically caught in a neocolonial structure dominated by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, US Treasury Department, European bondholders. No. Now they run into some financing problem. They can go to the People's Bank of China. They can go to the Reserve Bank of India. They can go to Indonesia. There are lots of places that will give them financing. In fact, at better concessionary rates than they would get from European bondholders. So they don't have to hold their tongue because they're afraid of the political and economic repercussions from the West. That's an interesting phenomena. And that actually explains a lot of why Bolivia, Nicaragua, these countries joined the South African case against Israel at the ICJ. These countries, Colombia included, came out and said, we're with you, South Africa, on this, and we're with the Palestinians. So that's the first thing, that they don't have the kind of economic shackles that they used to. But there's a second thing, and this is extraordinary because, Jay, I've followed and been and covered wars a lot. And the US war in Iraq was horrendous. I mean, the way the United States bombed things was horrendous, and so on. The Israeli bombing in Gaza is yet another level of that. It's at another level. The 85 bombs that were dropped to kill Syed Hassan Nasrallah and the Hezbollah leadership was more bunker buster bombs than the United States used in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. Yeah. Just that one day bombing was greater than all the US bombs in 2003. If there were evidence of Russian bombing in Ukraine that is similar to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and now in Lebanon, that would be wall to wall on CNN, on every single channel, Fox News, MSNBC, all of these propagandistic channels would have to run that because it would prove that the Russians are barbarians. It's very interesting. Ukraine's major airports in Odessa and Kiev are all functioning. The Russians haven't bombed the airports. When the United States attacks a country, it destroys all means of transportation. Gaza used to have an airport, the Yasser Arafat airport near Rafah. I've been there to that land, which used to be the airport. No longer. Why? Because the Israelis wiped it out the first time they bombed Gaza, the major bombing. They wiped it out, never allowed it to be rebuilt. So the point is that there is something qualitatively different in the way this bombing is happening. And I think for a lot of people with a historical memory of colonialism, they understand something quite fundamental. When the first aerial bombing on record is the Italian aerial bombing of Libya in 1911, bizarrely, exactly 100 years before NATO bombs Libya again. And when between the bombing by the Italians of Libya and the British bombing in northern Iraq in 1924, an entire doctrine of aerial bombardment is created. This doctrine is deeply colonial. So Arthur Bomber Harris, his nickname was Bomber, squadron leader Arthur Harris, British RAF pilot, was very well known for talking about what this bombing should be. And his idea was aerial bombardment should be pedagogical. In other words, we need to bomb these savages so fiercely that they will learn a lesson. They will learn never to doubt us. That we don't bomb them strategically to win a war or to stop the advance of their horsemen or whatever it is. They don't have tanks. We don't do that. We've got to bomb them so harshly, so savagely, that the savage will be scared to rise up against us. And that, in my opinion, is what I consider colonial aerial bombardment. And I think what Israel is doing in Gaza is not just a bombing. This is not Dresden 1944-45. This is a different level of colonial aerial bombardment, and a residual memory of that has been awoken. I've talked to people, intellectuals and others all over the world. I travel a lot. And in the last year or so, people have been horrified by the nature of the bombing, not necessarily merely, not merely the nature of the casualty level, although that's horrific, but the nature of the bombing has been just ugly and ferocious.
Yeah. They're in some ways I was thinking, controlling the high ground is like a ancient medieval thing. Just if you have the hill, I mean, if you could imagine if Hamas had fighter jets that were able to fly like this, it's a different world. Like this is just if you have that area, and now of course the fight over who controls space is getting kind of quietly weird in the future of who gets to bomb who from space. I'm not sure how much higher you get than space, but that seems to be the next battleground.
Before you go ahead, just to make one point here, which is I think quite interesting, is you see, it's interesting when the Yemenis fire a rocket, or the Iranians fire a rocket, the discourse around that is almost as if it's unfair. Like it's unfair that the Yemenis are firing rockets. That there is an attempt to fight over the air is unfair because the colonial military forces must have sovereignty over the air. You should have no. I mean, it's fascinating when the situation in Libya in February, March in 2011 was deteriorating. I mean, it was a civil war. It wasn't a genocide. That was proved by Amnesty afterwards. The language of genocide and so on was ridiculous in 2011. I covered that war. I can tell you it was a civil war. Both sides had jet planes and so on. But the UN passed a resolution calling for a no-fly zone in Libya, even though both sides had aircraft. Now, it's interesting, in Palestine, in Gaza, not one of these people has mentioned the phrase no-fly zone. Why do you need a no-fly zone when one person controls the flight? But if the Yemenis fire a rocket, that's unfair. And they must be bombed to prevent them from firing a rocket so that only one side, the colonial side, has superiority, or not superiority, sovereignty over the air.
I want to pick up more on this new mood of the global South, because I don't know if you know the path that I've taken to all of these roads. I made a film with Sam Harris, and obviously I haven't been a fan of what he's done with that conversation lately, or many of these kinds of people. But I could hear them chirping in my head about, well, this guy Vijay is talking about fairness, and maybe he's drawing this like moral equivalence between these two tribes or these two civilizations. They give you the kind of the clash of civilizations of like, no, that's all well and good, but it's clear one side should win this from some like utilitarian objective point of view, because one side just wants chaos and death and destruction and authoritarianism. The other side wants openness and whatever. Capitalism and democracy is the way that they achieve that. I mean, I don't want to completely discount that argument out of hand, because I think there's more to it and a deeper layer. And so what I want to try to put on your plate and have you to respond to is some of that, but also this idea of this notion of dignity, of even if I promise you peace, prosperity, a McDonald's or Starbucks in every corner, but you're going to get it through my way, which was, crawling through the dog door, and apologizing for your savagery and whatever else, I think people wouldn't do it. Some people would. And these are the people the CIA finds to help pull off the coups, of course. But I think that aspect of the psychological need for dignity is the part that is so misunderstood by some of the, let's say, utilitarian moral philosophers of the world, who give you this argument about peace all the time, land for peace or whatever it is, but they don't seem to understand this level of justice that requires a sense of dignity. And just before you answer it, I've been asking people a lot this very simple question lately, because I think something really has to change here. I ask them, and I forget who it is, I'll have to put it on the screen. What are the two cities that are projected to be the most populous cities on planet Earth in the year 2100? I don't know if you know the two off the bat. So most people, just without thinking very much, New York, LA, maybe something in China. It's Lagos, Nigeria, and Kinshasa, Congo. And the current estimates are 88 million. I mean, of course, this is subject to change, but 88 million people in Lagos and 83 million people in Kinshasa. Those are insane, massive numbers. Those people are going to want some damn dignity. And something has to change. 75 years is not a long time away. So I'm giving this as a pitch to people like you and me who maybe feel a different sense of justice and fairness, and other people who that just doesn't ring for, because they just think in sort of utilitarian, pragmatic ways. And for them, this should be an emergency because of what I just said. Because the global world order, even if you're happy with it and you think it should stay and you think these Palestinians and these Africans or whoever's rising up should just shut up and play along and just enjoy the capitalism because isn't it great? If they just did that, this would all be cool. It's not. Because of what I just told you, like that number should scare everybody of like, this has to change. Whether you're a social justice warrior who cares about the fairness of it, or you're just a pragmatic, I want to keep my house, this is going to break. So that's my pitch for the new mood of the global South, but also hopefully the like scared shitless mood of the global North. Whether you hate Vijay Prashad and his justice stuff or not, you should be scared. That's my pitch.
So, let's start in the West Bank. I've reported from the West Bank several times, and most people reporters like me who want to really understand the situation in the West Bank, really want at some point or the other look at the question of water. Water is a big issue in that part of the world, and anybody who's read the Bible knows that water is a huge issue because, people are forever having hallucinations and looking for water and whatnot. Anyway, there's a village just north of Ramallah called Nabi Saleh, where there's an emblematic fight every Friday. In fact, Ben Ehrenreich wrote a really good book about this called The Way of the Spring. I've reviewed it. I very much like this book by Ben. I think he did a great job. Those who don't know him, Ben Ehrenreich is the son of Barbara Ehrenreich, who died recently, maybe some months ago. A tremendous reporter, tremendous person, Barbara Ehrenreich. Anyway, Ben's book and what you see there and what I found when I was in Nabi Saleh twice is that on Friday, there is a confrontation at a spring. Why? This is an old Palestinian village. Now, we're not talking about whose land this is originally. We're just talking about the fact that there's this big Palestinian village right there, and then there's a settlement. Largely, they're not all Israelis, but I think they're all Jewish from different parts of the world. But a lot of the people live in that illegal settlement, Israelis. The water has been diverted to the settlement. The Israeli military is tasked with, quote unquote, protecting the source of the water for the settlement and not allowing Palestinians to even fill jugs, which is what they do in this protest. Now, let's just consider the absurdity of this, okay? There are two sets of people. One set of people has lived there for a very long time. Other set of people is living there in a beautiful American-style suburb, effectively illegally because it violates international law. But let's just set aside the international law business. You have two people living there. There's a spring. Why can't you even share the spring? I'm not even saying let's follow the rules of the Oslo Accord, which is the most conservative thing. The settlement is a violation of the Oslo Accord. I mean, it's not even like the violation of the UN Charter. It just violates the accord that the government of Israel signed. But let's leave all that aside. Let's just consider, here's village A, village B. Here's the spring. Why can't you share the water? If you refuse to share the water with real people living there, the real people living there are going to get angry. And I think that comes to the heart of dignity. These are claims of dignity. And what's wrong? If you're a moral philosopher, how can you claim to have a moral philosophy if you don't have the question of dignity front and center? People are not motivated merely by economic needs. They're also motivated against humiliation. You don't want to feel humiliated. What's wrong with that? I don't want to feel humiliated. There are millions of people in the United States who feel humiliated for the way they are treated because they are not white, or they are gay, or that they are treated in a sexist way. Somebody patronizes them, or they don't get a promotion, whatnot. These are all dignity claims. Dignity is a core element. You eat and you want dignity. Core elements of being a human being. And I just think, when people overthink the whole question of like the occupation and this and that, and fiery debates take place, I frequently think of that spring in Nabi Saleh and the settlement. And I just think about the fact that these teenage, Israeli soldiers, and by the way, when I was there, most of them were American. Unlike you, they didn't go for a civilian tour in Israel. They
Oh,
went for a military tour in
I
Israel.
didn't go on it just to complete
No,
that. I
no.
just
Unlike you,
yeah. Oh
unlike
yeah.
you had the opportunity, they
Yeah.
went for a military tour.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
a civilian tour. And so, imagine what it's like to be these soldiers, or imagine what it's like. And what's to me horrifying, to be honest, in this particular conflict, are the videos I watched, and I just watched a movie that was made, I think, by Double Down Films. I think that it was Double Down. I can send it to you later. You
Yeah.
could
I
put
would
it
love
up
to.
on the screen. It's
Yeah.
a film which basically takes the clips from social media of Israeli soldiers
Oof.
and what they did when they went into Gaza, playing
Yeah.
with women's lingerie, blowing up children's toys, and so on. That kind of erasure of humanity really bothers me a lot.
Yeah.
It bothers me a lot because that's the reverse of dignity. You can't settle these things. Ukraine is going to have to live next to Russia.
Yeah.
The Palestinians and the Israelis are going to have to live together. Netanyahu and the other nutcases are wrong. You can't erase the Palestinians into forever. They're going to live there, man. You're going to have to be neighbors. If you're not going to be able to share the water, if you're not going to be able to share the soul, by which I mean dignity. I give you dignity, you give me dignity. That's a matter of sharing the soul. Our souls have to, in a sense, find each other. I have to treat you with dignity, and then you treat me. It's what we consider hospitality. In many of the Asian worlds, the very key term is hospitality. When somebody comes to my house, what's the first thing I give you? If I came into your house, Jay, what's the first thing you'd give me? If you didn't give
Yeah.
this to me, I would say he is not sharing his soul with me, which is a glass of water. A guest comes to your house. Before you offer them anything else, you give them. In India, the first thing you give somebody is a glass of water. In any Arab country, the first thing they give you is a glass. Why? It's a sign of hospitality. What you're saying is, I see you. I see you. You are a human being. And then you see me. And hospitality is the basis of friendship, is the basis of fellowship. And so when you talk about dignity in that way, it moves me a lot because,
Yeah.
again, I come back to a situation where there's a
The
spring.
spring.
That spring is neither Israeli nor is it Palestinian. In fact, that spring doesn't give a shit about human beings. Nature doesn't care about human beings. The trees outside my apartment in Santiago, they're not growing for my pleasure. Okay. Maybe some of these plants we put here for my pleasure. But the trees are just growing. They don't even know I exist.
Yeah.
Maybe they are bothered by me because I'm driving a car and it creates pollution. But they are independent of me. The spring is independent of Nabi Saleh. It's independent of the settlement. It's independent of the Israeli soldiers. But somehow we have made the spring into a point of contention and conflict and reduced the possibility of hospitality and dignity. I find that horrendous, horrendous.
That was amazing. Let me give you, because I am a moral philosopher, I'll give you the because I think I could take it even further. Again, I'm always trying to play devil's advocate for these people who I disagree with, but their best argument would be like, well, it's gotten so bad now that maybe the Palestinians don't want to share it because they're so angry. Whatever. Let's set that aside. Even if that were true or untrue, I don't think it's very true. But even if it were, if they were like, well, what if we set up an economic system that the one group was like, well, we'll sell you the water. You can have access to the water at this cheap price. Yeah, it'll be in our currency, and we control the how much that's worth, and you have to pay it. Maybe we'll tax it a little bit. Like, we'll set up this whole system, and you could earn money and do this kind of thing. And let's just say here's the real kicker to the moral philosophy that I want people to really get your point. Let's just say we had a perfect simulation machine, and we took that world and we simulated that system, and it actually was getting more people water in that world. They were maybe they were a little miffed about it, but more people were drinking the water and it fed more people or whatever. But in the world but the other world is no, we're not accepting that bullshit deal because you've harmed us and there's been injustice done and we need to figure this out in another way. That's not a solution. And let's just say that world is less people are drinking water. I'm still insisting, and the utilitarian doesn't understand this, being oh, you choose the universe where more people are getting water. No, because if you don't factor in this level of dignity, people will starve than be undignified, or take your little drippings. As you may have seen this one, actually I did some traveling in Kenya. It was a perfect example of this. It's actually the Clinton Foundation. Maybe it's a perfect example. It was in the big slum in the middle of in Nairobi. I forget, Kibali maybe it is. I forget the name of it. The big slum there. Yeah, and they have water problems, like many slums in Africa, and very little access to water, for various reasons. And then there's these cartels who kind of pop up and own it and start selling it. And we could talk about all of the problematic ways that people don't have access to clean water in these slums. Well, the Clinton Foundation comes in and sets up this system with these blue water towers all over the place that's run by this charity. They're very well intentioned, right? And and everyone has suddenly in this very poor slum like a lanyard around their neck with a little RFID chip that keeps track of they have to pay for it, but it's like way cheaper than when the cartels were doing it. And they go and they use the RFID chip and they do this kind of stuff. And you can imagine this as almost a solution to your spring or whatever. But the way that people talked about it, of course, some people are like, well, I got water, I could feed myself and my baby a little better now, and so this is a step in the right direction. But this is not some sort of dignified solution that the American technological empire descended upon this like a benevolent God from the sky and gave you this thing. This is not a dignified addressing of the historical injustices that are being done there. And I wish more people would kind of understand that, who don't understand why the Palestinians or any of these people that we've talked about are throwing such a fuss. And, what a silly way for me to say something that gets called terrorism. And I don't mean to downplay it, right? These are horrible, awful things of murdering people and hostages and all this kind of stuff. But from some abstract moral philosophy classroom, I could say that, they're throwing a fuss because this is an undignified way to live. And yes, that comes out in all kinds of messy ways with religious overtones to it. And I've talked about this in previous essays, but I wanted to kind of help your argument even further for the moral philosophers in the crowd that if you do not factor in this dignity, this is not going to stop. This is never going to stop. And I want people to understand that. And I don't know. I know you don't have forever. I want to talk to you forever, but I do want to finish this with, because I think what I laid out, and you probably agree with it, we're at a very scary moment in time right now, because I think you and I maybe what we're doing here is talking about why there is such confidence in the global South to raise a fuss for a variety of reasons. But you tell me how frightened we should be about this particular moment in time. Because empires and global structures fall and crumble and change, but we've never seen it with this many nuclear weapons in the hands of the empire that's falling. Are we going to be able to get through this? Is kind of my question.
Okay, so let me go through your moral philosophy, devil's advocate thing to this, okay? Because I think there could be a straight line. I live in Santiago in Chile. I come to the United States once in a while. I was just in New York for the UN General Assembly week. And, one of the striking things, and I flew from New York to Italy. I had a meeting at the Feltrinelli Foundation. I mean, it was a very interesting period for me, just visually. When you arrive in New York and walk in Manhattan, it destroys the soul. There are really lots of very poor people standing around on the street. Living on the street is really a wrong expression. Standing around.
Yeah.
I saw a man without pants walking around. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just depressing, And here's the question: is that okay? You're a rational actor. Here, Mr. Moral Philosopher, you're a rational actor. You've lost your life. You've got no pants. Why don't you pick up a brick and smash the window of a department store, get arrested, go to prison, have a shower, get 3 meals a day, a bed to sleep in. It's definitely warmer than sleeping on the street in any winter of Manhattan. But in the summer, maybe it's cooler. I don't know. Haven't been to one of New York's prison. But why aren't 1,000 people who are basically degraded on the street, just going to jail to get 3 meals a day. Well, they're not doing that because they still prize their dignity,
Yeah.
even though they have no pants and are sitting on the street. So, those who don't understand the entire world of how dignity is important have never talked to a homeless person. Homeless people don't want necessarily to go into a shelter where they get searched and they get harassed and so on, because that infringes upon their dignity. I occasionally stop and chat with somebody, and I've asked people, hey, listen, the best hustle would be you just go to jail. You get to eat there. And they're like, are you crazy? I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to submit to inspections and things. I prefer begging on the street and eating a slice of pizza a day or whatever. That's dignity. I'm sorry to use this example because it's a
No, it's
dire
great.
example, but it actually, sort of fits the bill in a way. Look, you and I are talking on the day or at the end of the day when the Nobel Committee announced that the Nobel Prize for this year goes to the survivors of the atomic bomb attack in Japan in 1945, who since 1945 have been struggling to fight against nuclear madness, including making popular the cranes that are then floated on water during Hiroshima Day every year. And by the way, less and less people around the world have been celebrating Hiroshima Day. I hope one of the outcomes of this prize is that this coming year, more people in August will celebrate Hiroshima Day. It's totally neglected. When I was a child, my whole school used to stop on Hiroshima Day. We'd have to write an essay. In my school in Calcutta, we'd have to write an essay. One student in each class won a prize. It was like a bag of candies or whatever. Then there was a drawing prize for Hiroshima Day. Everybody drew the mushroom cloud. One person per class won a little award, again, probably a bag of maybe a 5-star candy bar. Nothing important, but we all learned about Hiroshima and the dangers of nuclear weapons. I bet that doesn't happen in New York City today. I bet kids in PS, whatever the hell, aren't being taught about nuclearism.
No.
And so some of it is that we have forgotten
Yeah.
how horrible and dangerous this is. And I very much hope that people like you, people like the Nobel Committee and others, would bang the drum to bring back public education about the dangers of war, the dangers of nuclearism. I think this is extremely neglected in the education of young people. There's a great worry, I know, in lots of countries, everywhere in the world about bullying, online bullying for children, bullying in person, and so on. Well, but if you don't have a curriculum that emphasizes peace, that's what you get. The bullying thing doesn't come out of nowhere. Of course, kids were bullied when I was a kid, when you were a kid. Of course, kids were bullied. But we also had a curriculum of peace. We were taught about conflict resolution. We were taught about the dangers of war. We were taught about anti-colonial struggles. This was part of my curriculum when I grew up in a normal school, not some special left-wing school. The normal schools had this in the curriculum. And I really want to insist that some of the antidote, and I don't like people who say, well, there's not enough time. Of course, there's always time. If there's not enough time, then what are we talking about? Let's just, go out, eat a pizza, drink a bottle of Jack Daniels, watch some stupid movies from the past. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, if I hate people who say, the climate is going, there's not enough time, we got to do something. You're just creating panics. There's enough time for us to do things, to talk, to argue, to go out there and say, look, if not the United States, the New York education system should start taking Hiroshima Day seriously. A campaign to bring back, stopping classes on that day and having a full day about the dangers of nuclear. All of that to me is monumentally important for the construction of humanity. It's not about politics. It's a construction and preservation of humanity, And so I would say that to you, what's the future bring? It brings, I'm getting drunk tonight. Okay. It brings that was guaranteed before you and I talked. What it really brings is it brings people with sensitivity to try to make a difference. And you don't have to make a difference by saving the world. Neither you nor I are the sons of God. Okay, we are not messiahs. We are just ordinary blokes having a conversation. Other people are ordinary people. We'll all do our little bit as sensitive people, try to make the world better. That's really all you can do.
Well, let's hope. Let's hope we can do that. Before you go, can I ask you the one question, because I'm curious, just your take on the U.S. election, since it's coming up very quickly, on what people can do and who they pull the lever for, or if this matters, or if this is just as bad as you've seen it in the U.S. as far as what you just said, that people are feeling quite hopeless and maybe convincing themselves that one of the levers is the one to pull.
Let me ask you a question. How old are you?
42. My first vote ever, I turned 18, was for Ralph Nader. So there you go.
Okay. Which year?
2000.
I'm not doing the math fast. 2000.
Yeah. I voted in 2000.
Then let me ask you a question then. 2000. Okay. On the ballot was George W. Bush, right?
Yeah.
Then in 2004, George W. Bush, who had already gone into and destroyed, large parts of the world. Then in 2008, it was equally bad. And then 2012, and then blah, 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 right? Maybe 2008, you said Obama's going to come and save the world and whatnot. Okay, whatever. A lot of people do. The fact of the matter is, from time immemorial in the United States, people have gone into the loneliest place in the US on election day, the ballot box, and have had to deal with the lesser evil problem. This probably goes back to the first presidential election. Okay, imagine people having to vote between Reagan and Jimmy Carter, or then Reagan and Walter Mondale, or whatever. I mean, when is the last time people have had a choice for one of the opposing candidates that people of sensitivity or people of the left have actually said, I want this person? Was it Eugene Debs? Was it Henry Wallace? One of my last not interviews, long sprawling conversations with Noam Chomsky. When we were doing our book on Cuba, my daughter walked into the room and she had just come away from an Arabic exam, and so Noam was like, "Oh, Arabic exam." So I called her over, and it's great because I have this on tape. Noam asks her, well, what are you reading? And she says, well, we're doing the following and so on. And then he says, in 1948, I worked for Henry Wallace for his presidential campaign. And just for fun, I wrote a few of his speeches in Arabic. And I thought that's charming. So Noam Chomsky worked for Henry Wallace. And from 1948 till now, Noam would never say to vote for any of the candidates because they're all subpar. So, I mean, I feel I want to give you my sympathy on the day of elections when you enter that lonely place. And I very much hope that when you come out of doing whatever you're going to do in there, I very much hope you hug somebody, maybe the next person in line, and just say that, for God's sake, before I die, let me at least once go into that voting booth and vote for somebody I'm passionate about who can actually win the election. Well, what can I say to you?
I don't mind telling you, my ballot is empty. And it's not the first time I've filled one out. And so I actually don't need a hug when I come out.
But you do. You do. Because empty doesn't sit in the president's chair. And so what I mean is that you should long, and I long for you, that at some point in your life you vote for somebody who wins,
That'd be nice.
You are passionate about. That's what I mean.
I definitely have.
Is not going to.
I definitely have the Jill Stein fans, and I'm a fan of Jill. For anyone listening who just got mad that I not going to pull the lever for her, she's great. I'm glad. I hope a lot of people do. I will. This is just a book recommendation because I don't have time to go through the argument for people. But I read a lovely, wonderful, weird, as all of his books are, short little book by Slavoj Žižek called Violence. And the last chapter actually is sort of about a blank ballot and a story, frankly, from Chile, a Chilean writer. It's an amazing story, a science fiction story about a day where nobody voted and then the system collapsed, which is maybe the part that I'm actually kind of hoping happens sooner than later to get that day to come. But it was the one that sort of convinced me of the blank ballot. So that's just for people who are going to give me the Jill Stein comments, because I know I get them. But Vijay, this was amazing. I'm a huge fan of your work. Everyone follow all of your lovely books and your writing, and keep it up. And I'm just very grateful for people like you out in the world. I think we covered a lot of interesting ground, and I hope people dive into some of the rabbit holes of names you may have heard for the first time or a millionth time, like Gaddafi's name comes up. And if you're like most Americans, you know nothing about him other than some boogeyman on the TV, and there's a lot more to that story. Just look up the gold dinar that he wanted to use for oil. And anyway, there's a lot of threads to go down. We don't have time to go down all of them, but I hope more people are in this past year not just wallowing in, like you said, that we don't have time, but actually discovering things and putting things together. And I think more conversations like this and brainstorming about what we can do to galvanize this moment and get through it with, as you said, I think the best line you said was what we eat and want dignity, whatever you said. That's the quote of like, let's figure out how to do more of that. Because my final pitch, and I put it in the last essay, is that of course we all want peace. And you were talking about peace studies and conflict resolution. But I think peace is not something you go after directly. I think peace is an emergent property of the conditions of justice being fulfilled, which is a constant attention and revisiting of the past. And sometimes, as I'm a philosopher, sometimes those windows do close and it becomes impossible to achieve justice, which doesn't solve the problem of dignity, but it's something we all have to admit as well. But some of those windows are still open, and we need to find them and charge towards them as fast as we can, which is, I think, why Palestine hasn't gotten so many people so excited. So I'll stop talking. I'll let you go. I'm a huge fan. Thank you, Vijay. This was great.
Awesome. It's great to be with you. And let's end with Kwame Nkrumah. Always forward, never backward.
Always forward, never backward. I think The Simpsons took that and twisted it in another way, but Kwame did it, and Kwame did it better. Thank you so much.
Okay, cheers. Bye.
So I obviously loved that conversation, and now here are some of my thoughts as well as references that I mentioned I was going to be giving if you want to go deeper. So I'm sort of just taking it from the beginning of our conversation to the end, so I'm just sort of tackling it in that order. And first, we spoke a lot about African liberation movements. So I'm linking to Kwame Nkrumah's speech, to the Pan-African leaders that Vijay mentioned. All of this can be found in the description below. I've also linked to a speech from Nkrumah that I really liked that he gave from exile. I think these were radio addresses. I believe he was in Guinea giving these speeches. I've also included the Patrice Lumumba speech, which Vijay mentioned, where he rather boldly speaks about the harsh treatment of the Congolese at the hands of the Belgians, with the Belgian king just sitting right next to him. And Lumumba was killed very soon after giving the speech, and it's quite a gruesome story. Actually, involves dissolving his body in acid, perhaps, and you could go into it, but be forewarned. But the speech is rather incredible as well. And then Gaddafi and Libya mentioned, we mentioned them a few times, and I included a link to Gaddafi's idea and the proposal that I mentioned very briefly about introducing a gold dinar as a Pan-African currency, which African nations he was proposing could use to trade their oil, which of course competes with the dollar. And the history of the petrodollar after the 1973 Arab embargo on oil, which was, let's just call it a collective type of sanctioning, really, in response to Israel's behavior, particularly at that time around the Suez Canal, is really important. I'm going to be discussing that in an upcoming conversation as well, but I urge you to spend some time with that subject. I've also included emails, the leaked emails from Hillary Clinton around the planned killing of Gaddafi, where she very much points to this sovereignty over currency as the real threat to the American and Western and European interests in having basically unfettered access to Nigerian oil and other reserves being found on the continent and just off its shore as well. I also put in a few links about the idea of non-alignment and the history of the non-alignment movement in Africa, which was basically an idea of just kind of staying out of the Cold War and not declaring allegiance to either the American vision of things or the Soviet one. And that also leads to another name that Vijay mentioned of George Padmore. And I mentioned I'm really just getting interested in this entire slice of history. And George Padmore is a name that I may have vaguely heard, but I knew nothing about. And so I haven't read the book that I'm about to recommend, but apparently he wrote a book in 1956 that seems incredibly important for the subject that I just mentioned. The book was called Pan Africanism or Communism, and it apparently is Padmore examining the tension between the two dominant ideologies that were competing for influence in Africa during the mid-20th century. Pan-Africanism, which sought to unify Africans and build a future based on independence and solidarity, and communism, which had its own vision for Africa aligned with Soviet-style ideology. Padmore, I guess, was a former communist himself, and he critiques both colonialism and Soviet communism. I guess he argues that the most viable path for African countries lies in Pan-African unity rather than aligning with external powers or ideologies. And he explores the challenges facing newly independent African nations, emphasizing the need for African-led solutions to ensure true independence, both politically and economically. So again, I haven't read it yet. You might beat me to it. I have a long list, and if you do, please let me know about it. Or if you've read it, please let me know if it's worth my time. It sounds like an incredible historical document because it really leads into some of my next conversations or references. But before that, also I included the references to the atomic bomb mines, or the mines where the uranium that was used in the atomic bombs that's in Congo comes from. It's called Shinkolobé. This article that I'm linking from Wired is actually quite interesting about what Oppenheimer didn't tell you. And of course, getting into it will also help disavow anybody of this belief of the American interest in democracy, let's put it that way, and really what has always kind of been ticking underneath of it. So also here is a book about the story of Guatemala in 1954 that we mentioned for a while, the Chiquita Banana stuff and the Dulles brothers. I did read a chapter of this while researching this, and it's great, so I'm excited to read the whole thing there. And then to bring this even a little more to the Palestine issue and maybe the psychology that I want to talk about, I was really struck by Vijay briefly mentioning the story of Mobutu in Zaire and maybe the ideological or psychological disagreements with someone like Lumumba. It was kind of the idea, if you remember it, of, sovereignty meaning just cultural sovereignty rather than sovereignty over the land and economic independence, basically just accepting the conditions of neocolonialism, really, but having cultural sovereignty, whatever that means. This is Mobutu's idea. And I think there are some parallels here to Gaza and the pre-October 7th world, because I have a friend, Ali Rizvi. I've gone on his show from time to time, and he was telling me about a Palestinian friend of his who was in Gaza and really is no fan of Hamas, because the friend was just really furious that Hamas kind of made this decision for her to upend her life. Maybe she was just trying to make the best of her situation, as difficult as it was, but, she was okay, even with all of the restrictions. I presume there's a range of psychological temperaments to that kind of thing. But then Hamas did what they did on October 7th, and the suppression of the uprising has been just unbelievably brutal and shameful, and obviously has quickly elevated to just full-fledged genocide. And I see some parallels in some of these liberation efforts and arguments with someone like Mobutu. And maybe some more hardline, maybe freedom lovers or oppression haters like Lumumba. I presume these kinds of internal fights happen all the time within these movements. Basically about just how much pain we're all willing to endure to achieve freedom. And I think sometimes that's a bit of a lowest common denominator equation. You only need a small portion of the group to be willing to endure tremendous pain and violent response in order to seek their freedom. And so when they make that choice and do whatever they're going to do, the response and the pain really does spread to everyone as a response. I saw recently Ta-Nehisi Coates making this point using the Nat Turner analogy, which I also used in my video, Do You Condemn Hamas, if you're interested. And I think it fits here because Nat Turner's slave rebellion, which included some pretty ugly violence, was met by a crushing response by the state of Virginia, where incredibly harsh conditions were placed on all slaves and even free blacks, that's free in quotes, after the rebellion. They didn't just punish the particular slaves who participated and picked up arms and fought. They made life even more unbearable for those who didn't. And I'm sure that included some slaves who were not at all in support of the tactics of Turner's group, and may have even included some who were trying to make the most of their, very restricted lives. Anyway, I don't have a real answer to any of that, but the analogy I think is illuminating and important, and it kind of brings me to my next link, because I think the segment of the conversation with Vijay about what the task is of a new country after expelling a colonizer was really, really important. And I didn't want to shy away from the things that happen in these places and in these phases, because I'm rattling off a bunch of names here that many people really despise, and not for no reason. In the West, we're told to despise them, but there's plenty of people who despise them for all kinds of real reasons. So just that simple point that Vijay made about the argument for the maybe necessity of unity in order to get kind of the post-colonial project off the ground, coupled with the lack of literacy and education that he mentioned, coupled with some of the powerful elites who amassed power and wealth by maybe working with the colonizers when they were there that he also mentioned, coupled with these aggressive and powerful multinational corporations which still sit on your natural resources, whether that be bananas or sugar or cobalt or whatever you have. All of that really is a very difficult maze to navigate. It's not a surprise to me that so many of these areas start to enact some seemingly authoritarian or, overly strict measures in these early phases. And of course that stuff, all that ugly stuff they do to do that, it gets cataloged and broadcast in the Western world as a way to almost justify the decades or maybe centuries of colonialism in the first place. And of course, it's all there just ready to pull off the shelf and use as a justification for removing, this brutal, freedom-hating authoritarian who just hates his own people at any moment that you see fit. And just to really drive this point home, this thing really has always happened. You could go back to the American colonies in the 1770s, leading up to the Revolutionary War, and study the significant tensions and violence between those who supported independence, they called themselves patriots, and those who remained loyal to Britain, or loyalists or Tories they were called. And even after the Revolutionary War and independence was gained, there was massive censorship against loyalist arguments, smashing and burning of their printing presses, violence, including the infamous tarring and feathering punishment. That was all done to loyalists. Some states even stripped them of their voting rights. And about 10,000 loyalists were exiled and forced to flee. They went to Canada, actually, and they had their property confiscated. I mean, you could imagine the press in London at the time of the savage American colonies and the authoritarian suppression of dissent and free speech. Groups like the Sons of Liberty were called insurgents and rebels. I'm sure you could fill in what they would be called today. And their leaders, like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, were branded as inciting violence and discord and being very anti-freedom as they crushed the dissent of their arguments. And the British Empire, while not having quite the tools of something like the CIA, did engage with spies and forging secret alliances with Native American tribes who had their own very good reasons to dislike the Patriots. So, of course, these patriot leaders had a lot of paranoia. They were always looking out for dissent within the ranks, and this led, of course, to the infamous Alien and Sedition Act of 1797 by John Adams, which basically made it illegal to criticize the government and allowed for the president to deport non-citizens who he deemed dangerous. It all sounds very familiar. Anyway, you get the point. As I so often do in these essays, I want to stress how ridiculous it is to treat any of these places, whether it be Congo or Cuba or Palestine, as some kind of, wild, uncivilized, unique case that just can't handle themselves. No. Human psychology and frailty really runs through everything. And history really does not repeat, but it does rhyme. I think that was Mark Twain that said that. But of course, like I said, this doesn't really erase that some absolutely ugly stuff happens in these phases. And someone like Fidel Castro has plenty of people who despise him. You can pretty much look up any of the names that Vijay and I discussed in our conversation and find volumes of their authoritarian crimes or crushing dissent. I don't want to discount or downplay the blood on their hands, but I am going to include a speech from Fidel Castro from 1961 that I've now read through, the one that he mentioned, and it's really, really quite interesting. And then just three more. This is the book that Vijay mentioned about the spring in the West Bank and this fight over water. It's called The Way to the Spring. And then to finish with just two fun ones, he also mentioned a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode about Palestinian fried chicken that I've linked to. I'm glad Vijay is a fan, and if you need a good laugh through all of the depression and pain in the cycles of this entire thing that we're going through, that episode is a good one. And then finally, another laugh, my very own reference that I just couldn't leave out of this video in this essay regarding the Simpsons' take on Kwame Nkrumah's famous slogan. Kwame's slogan was "Forward ever, backward never." But the Simpsons had their own take, and it's from the Treehouse of Horror, I think number 7, in the year 1996. And this is actually an alien taking the form of Bill Clinton and revving up the good people of Springfield politically. So I'll end with that, but my next episode or my next conversation is with Juan Cole, and that's all about geopolitics and how the clash of civilizations narrative and ideology often is not as good of an explainer of why the world is at conflict, other than just plain old resources and wanting stuff from the ground. So we're going to be talking all about resource wars and, of course, how that fits in to the Israel-Palestine issue and more. So enjoy that, but first, let's finish with The Simpsons.
My fellow Americans, as a young boy, I dreamed of being a baseball. But tonight I say we must move forward, not backward, upward, not forward, and always twirling, twirling, twirling towards freedom. Yeah!